Hello, my name is Dr. Moore, and I am a story doctor. Well, actually, I have my PhD in English literature, and I teach English at the upper school at Moravian Academy. Well, some of you may be wondering, so why the lab coat? Well, why not? Actually, I'll tell you how I got the lab coat. A few years ago, a very cheeky student of mine, whose parents were physicians, declared to the entire class that he wasn't going to call me Dr. Moore, but Mrs. Moore. He explained further that his parents believed that the title of doctor belonged to those who have a medical degree. Well, the class was entertained. I encouraged the student to address me with academic respect, and then we moved on. But his conviction not only led me to develop my persona as the story doctor, but also helped me reimagine how I see my work in the classroom. I believe that my discipline, English literature, benefits immensely when we treat it like the sciences, with time in the laboratory, experiential activities, and with research out in the field. In my classroom, or my story laboratory, we practice narrative medicine. Now, my narrative medicine field suggests two things. Number one, that the stories we analyze and create undergo clinical trials, if you will, directly on people. We work with others to collaboratively understand, create, and analyze stories. And secondly, my narrative medicine field also suggests that narratives function as medicine. Stories have a palliative, curative, and transformative effect on ourselves and on our lab partners, and we see this happen each year in my story laboratory. Well, let me tell you a little bit how the story laboratory began. In 2007, I inherited a short story course. It was an anthology course of short fiction, where we would read about stories, we would discuss stories, and then we would write about stories. I had mostly second semester seniors who were more or less, mostly less interested in doing the reading, the discussing, and the writing about stories. After 2 years of teaching this way, I became so frustrated. What was the matter with these students? I began thinking about them as first graders, imagining that, where did the wonder go? Why didn't they like stories? And I became fixated on this idea of reanimating those students' imagination and desire for stories. Well, that reanimation occurred when we were reading about 2 short stories about chrysanthemums. D.H. Lawrence's Odor of Chrysanthemums and John Steinbeck's The Chrysanthemum. I was so desperate for someone to care about these 2 stories that I gave them an experiential activity. I gave them a worksheet that they had to complete over the weekend. But this worksheet required action. Go outside and into the field, find flowers, talk to florists. Once you have your chrysanthemum, look at it, smell it, taste it, paste it to your worksheet, and then answer the questions. Well, when Monday arrived, the room was abuzz with activity. Not only had they lots of information to tell me, but they had stories about special flower moments in their lives, stories about how difficult it was to get chrysanthemums in the springtime. I had not realized that chrysanthemums are really a fall flower. But some seniors, intrepid seniors, they found some. I was flabbergasted. They kept talking, and then about 5 minutes left in the period, I brought the discussion back to Steinbeck and Lawrence, and I said, why did these authors choose chrysanthemums above all the other flowers? All the hands were raised. Everyone started talking. The bell rang, and I knew what I needed to do. I needed to get my classroom into the laboratory. Well, I knew that, but I also needed a structure for my course. So I decided to organize the class in 3 acts. to mirror the three acts of our lives: our beginning, our middle, and our end. So Act 1 becomes our childhood. We read folk tales and fairy tales, and we read children's literature, and our field work is with first graders. Act 2, we read first-person narratives, and we tell our personal stories. Act 3 becomes our time as in our elder years, and we work with the residents of Country Meadows Retirement Community, and we cull their life stories. Well, I'm going to tell you a moment from each of these acts and show you the work that and the power that narrative medicine has. Let me tell you about Act 1. A former student of mine, Damien, once subtitled Act 1 as Imagining Together. I can't think of a more perfect way to describe this. Damien, he didn't like English literature. He told me so. He didn't understand why stories were important. They had no meaning to him, and he was not skilled at finding their meanings. Stories were just made-up lies, after all, and what importance did it have in his life? Well, everything changed when he met his first grade partner, Rohan. Rohan loved words, loved stories, and loved Damien. This behind me is the result of their first ice-breaking activity. Rohan and Damien centered around Rohan's little desk, drawing side by side, imagining what they would like to have in their bedrooms. And they drew this. And what's incredible about this is that Damien saw what Rohan was doing and saw how fertile his imagination was and began to incorporate some of his ideas. Rohan just thought Damien was just so cool, and so he started putting some of Damien's design in his drawing. Their collaborative story, William versus Mr. Cruel, used many of those ideas they had in their ice-breaking activity. Now, William versus Mr. Cruel is the classic tale of the good wizard versus the bad wizard in outer space, with the ultimate redemption of the bad wizard and the ensuing friendship of William and Mr. Cruel. Now, to Damien, this act changed his life completely and changed his perspective on how he viewed stories. It was easy to find the meaning of this story because it simply charted the friendship of Rohan and Damien. In Act 1, the narrative medicine shows us that stories, even made-up ones, are important and have meaning. Well, let me tell you something about Act 2. Act 2, a student has subtitled this part of the course as showing the softer side of a person. And that's what we do. We share stories and we listen to one another. Every year, narrative medicine works and makes our class not just a class, but a community. But this past year, I had a group of divergent personalities, and I was wondering, is this going to happen? Are we going to form a community? It happened that a student came to me early on in the course and wanted to drop the course entirely. He said the personalities around him were too different, he would be miserable, and he could learn nothing. I told him to stay and give the course a chance. Well, I'm happy to report that he did stay. We listened to each other. We shared our stories. And we did become that unit, as I knew we would. As a matter of fact, a student on her final lab report mentioned that she said that the stories really had a difference for her. She said, the more I heard other people tell me stories and the more I told my story, I learned to love, accept, and understand who I am. A 16-year-old made this discovery about herself simply by sharing her story and listening to other people's stories. As a matter of fact, we were so close this past year and developed in such a close unit that we presented our story work at a local writers' conference. This is the selfie we took at the beginning of our presentation. And what I love about this picture is that it shows our willingness to share ourselves with everyone, even at our most vulnerable moment, speaking in front of a large group of people. I love that about this picture. And so that the narrative medicine of Act 2 cures us of our preconceived notions of one another and actually seals and strengthens us as a community. A great moment of Act 3 I want to share with you is about my student John and his Country Meadows partner, Mr. Barth. Well, here they are. That's their official school picture. But this is how I saw them as I did my rounds at Country Meadows. They were a riot together. Mr. Barth was in memory support, and he couldn't really remember much detail about his life, but he did remember some stories about the Navy, shore leave, and women. Now, my student John wasn't really interested in school, wasn't very academically aggressive, but he would get nervous coming back from these visits because he had nothing filled out on his worksheet. And I would ask John, well, what did you talk about? Well, we talked about the Navy and shore leave and women. Okay, that's enough about that. But this really began to bother him, that he didn't have all this data. But every time they would come back, I would ask John, did you have a good time talking to Mr. Barth? And he said he did. When it came time for John to make a creative project for Mr. Barth, these creative projects are some kind of reflection of the time that the partners have spent together and in somehow way communicates the partner's life. John panicked. He didn't have all that kind of biographical data that everyone else seemed to have about their partners. Well, I reminded John that he played the piano, and that counts as creative expression. So what John did was that he composed a piano piece called Across the Sea. At our final celebration, John played his piano piece to kind of represent Mr. Barth's time in World War II and his naval experience. As John played the piece, Mr. Barth's face was just filled with tears, and soon all of us sitting near Mr. Barth were crying as well. That's the power of narrative medicine. John wrote in his final lab report that he was stunned that he could have a relationship with a man who barely knew his name from week to week. John was an avid World of Warcraft player and of online interaction, and his life was completely changed by having this interaction with this man. And so the narrative medicine of Act 3 shows us, and actually taught John, patience and empathy, and showed the rest of us that every human life is beautiful and important. Well, my story laboratory does not use the usual formula of reading, discussing, writing about stories. My students explore stories in action, outside the classroom, in collaboration with others. We have all of these things to do, and what we have is an unbelievable moment. What we have, excuse me for just 1 second. What we have is narrative medicine working, right? We have, every year, I tell my students that if you devote yourself 100% to the work of the course can change your life. In the beginning, they are skeptical, but by the end of the course, I see what amazing discoveries they've made about themselves and others, and about what's really important in life, the ability to know yourself and understand others. Here's a secret that we learn about narrative medicine also. When they write things like on their final lab report that you taught us more than knowledge, you taught us wisdom, I smile. I smile because I know it wasn't me. The students themselves gained wisdom. Yes, I facilitated the activities, but the students explored story in such a visceral way that they themselves self-medicated with narrative medicine. And so here's another secret we learn about narrative medicine. You don't need to be in a laboratory to take it or to dispense it. And you don't need a prescription. Although, as your story doctor, for optimal results, I do recommend that you listen to and take stories at least twice a day. Side effects may include wonder, joy, reflection, curiosity, and most of all, transformation. So, if you're ever feeling despondent, dejected, or disconnected, or just want to know what life's all about, just take 2 stories and call me in the morning. Thank you.